We now move on to our next session on the book The Emissary, an historical fiction. We are pleased to introduce Mr. Vijay Nambisan, our critic for this book. Mr. Vijay Nambisan dropped out of IIT Madras and drifted into journalism because in those days there was no other field open for someone without a degree. He has worked and written for journals in many parts of India. His books are a selection of poems in Gemini, a journalistic book. Bihar is in the eyes of its beholder, an essay. Language as an ethic, interrogating India, the series. And a translation of two late medieval Bhakti poets from Kerala, the two measures of Bhakti. His collection of poems, First Infinities, is due out soon for Poetry Wala. Now, may we have Mr. Vijay Nambisan to share his views on the book.
You can see why I dropped out from IIT Madras. I can't get a mic to work. My name is Vijay Nambisan. I've been in journalism since 1985. I no longer say I'm a journalist because the profession has become a little dirty. Not a little dirty, very dirty. I prefer to call myself a writer. And I was never a news journalist, let alone an investigative journalist. I've always written features. Mr. Anirudha Bahal, whom I'm meeting for the first time today, though we have, I'm sure, many friends and acquaintances in common. He is, if not a household name, shall I say, a newsroom name in India. Every journalist knows his name. But we are not here to discuss his journalism because that would take, you'd have to have a journalism festival to discuss all that. He wrote a book about 10 years ago, I think, called Bunker 13, which I reviewed for Biblio. And that is the kind of novel you'd expect from a journalist who's at the cutting edge of his profession. It was about terrorism and spies and drug running. You had Russian gang lords and Indian gang lords and Pakistani spy masters. And it was what you would expect, you know. And that novel had mixed reviews. But The Emissary, when I was sent it to review, I couldn't believe that, one, it had been written by a journalist like Anirudha Bahal, and two, that Anirudha Bahal had written a book like that. I was so impressed by that novel that an Indian could be able to place himself in Alexandrine Greece, that is the 4th century BCE, and produce something which matched in tone the original, the classics that I have read in translation. So that is why I was eager to meet Mr. Bahal. And I'm glad, first, I thank the organizers for inviting me, and I'm happy they have given me the chance to meet Anirudha and ask him some questions.
Thank you, sir. We invite Mr. Karthikeya Mardar for the dramatized reading from the book, The Emissary. Mr. Karthikeya has been performing in Delhi theatre circuit close to a decade now. Although a PR executive by profession, he has in the past worked as an author for NDTV and acted with many directors.
Hello, everyone. I'll be reading the first part. I think this is where the story begins, The Emissary. I, Seleucus, son of Nicanor, begin my account from the time when Kylos, son of Patroclus, was the chief controller of the games in Olympia. They say that the start of an account is like a dot on a circle. It bridges the past and the future. It is my intention to narrate the story of my life as it happened, without any of the embellishment that authors of my time are inclined to furnish. I will give you accounts of battles and escapes and vendetta, which you must not confuse with imaginary tales, for these were real happenings, and what I didn't witness myself, I had other witnesses tell me. I have achieved much in this life. Wealth, women, victory and battle have all been mine. I've also suffered and seen the passing of those whom I've loved. In all this, I've been fortunate enough to be guided by those amongst us who can see the future. Though I call them men, their powers of prophecy are not of this world. And I've often wondered how they see what awaits us in the distance. One of the reasons I write this account is for posterity to know how we lived in the years that I'm going to speak of, and learn lessons from the pursuits that obsessed us. I have deliberated at length about where I should start. I could begin from the time when I was a small child, but when one is talking about important events and people, one should try and avoid bringing too much of oneself into the tale. Or people might say that Seleucus is trying to give too much importance to himself. I'm not a man of letters, and that's an advantage, for I will not attempt to dazzle you with words, but by the truth of what I say. Nor do I believe in destiny, except for that which I make myself and what I have achieved through pleasing the gods. As I narrate my tale, I will tell you occasionally of the circumstances in which I write. Though these personal narrations may be few and far between, they are, I believe, important because they reveal my thoughts as I occupied myself with the process of writing. Well, one thing I do promise to those who read this account: no compromise has been made with the truth. My name, as I told you at the very beginning, is Seleucus. But because of the fame of my father, I'm better known as the son of Nicanor. I grew up in Olympia in a Macedonian family that made its living by looking after the Macedonians who came to prepare for the annual games and visit the oracle. At my home, I spoke the Macedonian tongue, but my friends were largely from Olympia. My father, Nicanor, was a charioteer, and he raised horses for the races. I was 22 when Prince Alexander came to Olympia with his entourage and was refused participation in the games. Being a Macedonian, he was considered a foreigner. At every game, both the annual and the big one that took place every 4 years, there used to be a debate about whether to admit the Macedonians or not. They spoke a corruption of Greek, and some people didn't consider them proper Greeks for this reason. But Alexander claimed descent from Achilles, and so he was allowed to enter. Actually, the opposition to the participation of the Macedonians was a big sham, and organized mostly by the Athenians, who used Olympian exiles and other such disgruntled elements to create a fuss. There was never really any real intent to stop their involvement. The Athenians just made a lot of noise in order to insult the Macedonians. That year, Argus, son of Pathos from Pella in Macedonia, was the principal Macedonian participant in the 4-horse chariot race, though Pythagoras, son of Melander from Athens, was considered the favorite by most. My father was also favored by some, as he had been practicing for the whole year with his horses. But Argus from Alexander's team had his own diabolical intentions, which he executed 10 days before the race. He committed this treachery a week after practicing with my father. During that time, on one occasion, my father beat him by the length of one whole stadium in a practice race. It happened thus. My father refused Argus's appeal to practice jointly in the big ground behind the temple at Olympia, as he felt Argus would learn about his techniques and his strategy before the big race. But Argus complained about my father to Polemon, son of Agenor, who was managing the Macedonian delegation. He also spread the lie that my father was conniving with Pythagoras to defeat him. The truth, however, was that Argus was not even a likely contender in the race because his horses were inferior and his judgment so poor that he didn't know which horse to place in which position. Polemon spoke to my father Nicanor, and I was present when he spoke to him. Polemon said, "Don't we always seek your advice, Nicanor, on matters concerning the games? And we buy your horses to replenish our own, though we could get them from Thessaly where the finest horses are available. Don't we tell Macedonians to come and do business with you when they visit the oracle, and they come to you with gifts of grain and cloth? Now that we seek some stature at the games, why are you opposing Argus's request? If you two plan the race jointly, it will benefit Macedonia, as whoever wins, he will be a Macedonian." My father Nicanor replied thus, "I seek no glory apart from Macedonia. But the rules of the game state that there may be no collusion between participants before the race. Also, Argus and I seek the same glory. I shall give all my help for your delegation to win in other disciplines, such as wrestling and sword fighting. But please, do not ask for what is not mine to give." At this reply of my father, Polemon left angrily and reported the matter to Alexander, who was then only 16 but behaved as if he were already king. Alexander called my father to the nobleman's house where he was staying and addressed him thus: "Would it not be good, Nicanor, if 2 Macedonians could plan the race together and box in Pythagoras so that his chariot is pushed against the parapet of the stadium? In this manner, Polemon tells me you could defeat Pythagoras. We will offer you 2 talents for your services if you connive with Argus in this race. Alexander was under instructions from King Philip, his father, to win as many crowns as he could for the Macedonian delegation. For Philip wanted to demonstrate in the games the superiority of Macedonian discipline, and how only they could be trusted to teach the Persians a lesson. The 4-horse chariot race was the most famous race of the games. The individual who won it was assured renown for many years to come in all of Hellas. His fame would extend even to the Greek colonies of Asia. My father had taken part in this race many times, but had never won it. For 2 years running, he had defeated everybody else, but he came second to Pythagoras. Alas, only winning mattered. That year, he had even sacrificed a bull at the altar of Zeus in Olympia, observing all the proper rituals, and then asked the oracle about the outcome of the race. After examining the entrails of the bull, the Alamid priest signaled with his hands to the interpreters, but they were reluctant to tell my father what the priest had conveyed to them. It was a language that only the interpreters understood. I was also present as I was helping my father with the observances that went with a proper bull sacrifice. When my father insisted on knowing, the interpreters told him in private what the oracle had said, and my father kept the words to himself. Later in the evening, I met Pindar, who was the son of one of the interpreters, and he extracted the information from his father and told me. According to Pindar, the oracle said, "A mighty man will lose the race even before the start of the race." 2 days after the disclosure by the oracle, news came that Pythagoras' lead horse, a black steed by the name of Ammon, had picked up an injury in his foreleg and would not be able to run in the race. So Pythagoras was looking for a replacement. A stable hand by the name of Minos, who worked for Pythagoras, told this to his wife Helen, who in turn gave this detail to her father Kostinos, son of Dolorus, who in passing mentioned it to Kelos, the chief controller of the game. And Kelos, being a good friend of my father, mentioned it to him. That night, my father was very happy, thinking that the words of the oracle were coming true. Ammon had been the main reason, according to my father, why Pythagoras had won the race for 2 consecutive years. It would be very difficult for him to find a replacement at the last moment for the outer left position where the horse ran. Pythagoras had announced that he would race only if he was sure to win, and my father felt that without Ammon, he could no longer be sure of victory. My father's own horse in that position, Sarissa, would be far superior to anything that Pythagoras might find as replacement. Thus, he thought, the oracle saying that a mighty man would lose the race before the race began meant that Pythagoras would not race at all because of the injury to his horse Ammon. With this assessment at the back of his mind, he agreed to Alexander's request for training with Argus, as he estimated that with Pythagoras not racing, it would make matters less complicated and he would give some tips to the buffoon Argus without hurting his own chances. But when Argus too became familiar with the dilemma of Pythagoras, his ambition soared even more, and he began thinking of my father as the only obstacle between him and victory. Thank you so much.
We are pleased to introduce the author, Mr. Anirudha Bahal. Mr. Bahal is the founder and editor-in-chief of CobraPost.com, India's first investigative non-profit since 2013. He also co-founded Tehelka in 2000. His books include A Crack in the Mirror and Bunker 13. He has a comic coming out in 2015 in clear line style. In 2009, Mr. Bahal also hosted the Tony B Show on Channel B, a humor show on the lines of Ali G. We invite Mr. Nambisan and Mr. Anirudha Bahal for the discussion on the book, The Emissary.
I was pleasantly surprised actually. Sitting there in the audience, Emissary looked like something somebody else had done, and for the first time, actually yesterday when I was telling my daughter, elder daughter, that I was coming to Chandigarh, and she said, "Why are you going there?" I said, "I'm going for a reading of The Emissary. They've been kind enough to call me." And she's actually a great fan of The Emissary, having read it 6-7 times, and then she suddenly picked up some character, and I said, "Are you going to do that reading there?" And for a moment I was a blank. I didn't know who that character was, what that character had done. So it all started coming back in a way, and so that was very pleasant in a way.
Which character was this?
Actually, pleasantly, she's talking about Pythagoras. I mean, it was a very small character, but the villainy of the guy.
You studied English at Allahabad University, and you have said that you got hooked to history when Naipaul told you to read more history. You didn't read much history when you were younger before that?
No, no, of course I read history, but Vijay is referring to the fact that V.S. Naipaul, who was then on the board of the HELCA, in a conversation with me, he urged me that in order to develop further as a fiction writer, it would be more, I should take up the reading of history in a more sort of organized way, or in a more industrious way than perhaps I'd been doing. It's not that I didn't. I mean, I pick up books randomly looking about history. So in that sense, and in some ways it sort of dawned on me the relevance of what he was saying, because he uses history himself as a way to sort of read the future in many ways. And so he says, without really understanding history, you really don't know where you're going in many ways.
But you said you got stuck in Greek history. What fascinated you, and especially why the Alexandrine period? I mean, you could have picked Pericles' period, then you got Herodotus and Thucydides to guide you. But why the Alexandrine period?
Yeah, actually, I did read a lot of Thucydides, but to be very frank about it, the first few, I ordered a whole bunch of books from Amazon, and the first few books that landed up were from Greek history. And it got so fascinating. I mean, that period, I mean, I find that period even more fascinating than the Roman period. And reading about that. And Alexander has more sort of relevance and has more bandwidth in India, seeing that he came right up to a doorstep, a few 100 kilometers from here. And so in that sense, it evoked a much more historical consciousness in the Indian context than perhaps the Roman period would have done.
Yeah, but the chief source of Alexander's time is Arianus, a Roman writer, and who's supposed to have read Ptolemy's book, and which is no longer available. But can you tell me, the protagonist of this novel is called Seleucus Nicanor, which makes anybody who remembers school history immediately remember Seleucus Nicator, who was the general with whom Chandragupta Maurya had a treaty, and he married his daughter. Or Seleucus married whose daughter? Chandragupta married Seleucus's daughter. And he gave Seleucus a number of elephants with which Seleucus consolidated his own empire. So who is this Nicanor? You made up that. There was a general in Alexander's army called Nicanor, I found. But
yeah, there was. So I was playing on history, and Seleucus was actually ultimately, the size of the novel was perhaps half of what I had intended it to be. And perhaps the second half would have come right at the doorstep of Seleucus in that sense. But then it was getting too big and too unwieldy at the end of it. So I had to keep it short, and even I wouldn't even call this short in that sense. But
450.
That's right. So I didn't want it to land up something like 800 sort of pages or something. But I do have maybe 7 or 8 chapters which never went into the book.
But haven't you promised us a second?
Yeah, I have, and at some stage perhaps I will get down to writing it.
Because I would like to read that.
Yeah.
I want to see how you resolve these things with Ptolemy and Seleucus. Do you think you have been a bit too clever, maybe? In Bunker 13 also, the twist at the end, it was very powerful, but it was a bit too clever. And here also you're getting a Seleucus identified with a Ptolemy.
Giving away the book to people who may not have read it, but yeah, that's part of fiction writing. I mean, you want to make it interesting for the reader, as long as the plot supports it. So I find that you as long as it's smoothly done, and as long as it is relevant to the story, then it sort of falls in place.
Do you read a lot of historical fiction?
These days I'm reading a lot of contemporary history, which is more to do with the wars that we are having around the world, maybe doping in cycling, and random. I'm reading a lot of books on the way Stasi functioned in East Germany. So I think it's very essential for fiction writers to keep reading a lot of non-fiction, and on my part perhaps I end up reading maybe 3-4 books a month. I feel that if I'm doing something which doesn't allow me to read half an hour a day at the most, or perhaps more, then I'm not in the right profession.
Does your profession, does your journalism influence your fiction writing and vice versa? In what way?
My journalism, you could say, influences it in the sense of if I'm researching a particular topic, like I have a novel which I have written, which I have to revisit, which is set in Iraq in 2006-7, in the time of the insurgency there, and I had traveled myself in Iraq at the height of insurgency. So in that sense, I read a lot of my colleagues who were writing about Iraq. I traveled there. So in that sense, I do read a lot of material. But I consciously avoid reading fiction when I'm writing, when I'm working on my novel, because I don't want to be influenced by a particular style or so. That's one thing that I avoid is reading fiction, but non-fiction I pick up all the time.
Well, I found that fiction influenced my creative writing in the sense that I had to be brief. I couldn't, and also I had to convey something. I couldn't be too self-indulgent, you know. Do you find that that way journalism helps you? Because there is not a dull moment in this book. In fact, there is only one piece of introspection, 187 to 8, where he says, I do not know if I will live or die. I think start of book 3. Everything else, it's just action. Do you find that comes from journalism, the influence of journalism?
I think pace comes from something that you work on, and it comes from research and plot. So I think I find a lot of writers, fiction writers, are very lazy, and they feel as if research is something below them. In many ways, I find as if they denigrate research, but the more detailing and research that you do in a book, the harder you have worked, the more interesting your novel becomes in the end, and the more rich it is. And for a long time in the Indian context, at least I felt so, that we were stuck with this so-called literary. I mean, in order to be literary, you could do with less research. You just had to play with words and characters. But I don't feel that. I feel like Singer that any line or sentence that is not taking the plot forward is an unnecessary sentence.
Yeah, as I said before, what really impressed me about this novel was how perfectly you got the tone, how pat you got the tone of that. Okay, you were reading a lot of the original sources, but did it just come to you? You just naturally adopted the tone?
No, it is I think that is the most important part of a fiction writer. I mean, we all have stories to say, and we all say them. I'm talking about authors. But to me, the biggest sort of challenge comes right at the beginning, and I wrestle a lot over it. Perhaps takes months. I mean, I know I can tell you the story, but how do I tell it? I mean, what tone do I use? What style do I use? If I crack that, the rest is very easy for me, because I come from a background of being a journalist, and it's sort of subconsciously research is second nature, and you don't have to work on your research. It's something ingrained in you. So if you're working, the tone, I feel, is the most important thing, at least for me, before I start a work. And once I've cracked that, I'm easy.
No, that means you do several drafts to get the tone right? Or
No, I don't
sit
do
down
draft. I don't work at all till I get the tone in my head, that this is the right way to write this.
This book, I'm not giving any more of the plot away, I hope, but this book is full of conspiracies. It's full of little plots the protagonist is involved in, his enemies are involved in, his friends are involved in. Do you naturally think like that? Do you think you have a devious mind?
You could say that I have rich imagination. And I'm quite the prankster in my extended family and friends, if that can be considered devious. But I do think that in today's, I mean, though I am from a small town called Allahabad, which reminds me a lot of Chandigarh actually, and vice versa. It's, but I've been living in Delhi because my profession so demands since 1991, and it's been like whatever number of years, and nearly a quarter of a century. And the more I look at Delhi, there is one sort of truism that I always tell people about Delhi, that there is always a conspiracy in the city. And the city never exists in a vacuum. There is never any vacuum. I mean, you go to a coffee shop, you meet some friends, you will hear 10 conspiracy theories about the, the most engrossing sort of news of the week or the month. And I felt in many ways, I mean, from Tehelka to Cobra Post, this whole news journey that we have done as entrepreneurs since 2000, and before that, through 5-6 mainstream organizations that I worked in, including India Today, Express, etc., that you rather have your conspiracy theory there than somebody else's. So, and if you spread a conspiracy theory, I've been occasions, really, I'm not joking, that same story should come back to you within 6 hours. And that's the truth of that you have a good conspiracy going. So Delhi is like that. So perhaps a bit of it has gone into my head. Delhi, if you look at it, it's blood-soaked land. And it's always been unkind to its rulers. From Darius, who was dragged in the streets and hung, and right down to the present day, it's not really been very healthy for its leaders. For a variety of reasons, whether you look at Mughals or you look at the Panipat battle, and even Mahabharata, if you go back, so you go back in time, you go back in contemporary history, it's always been unhealthy for the people leading it.
That's why you have a Kuni Darwaza there. I don't know if you have a Kuni Darwaza anywhere else. And could I ask you one personal question? Do you like music? Do you listen to music?
I do listen to music, but you could say that it's rarer still, because unfortunately over the last 10-15 years what has happened is that my nighttime reading till recently was affidavits and fiction. So it just, the kind of work that we have done, there's a lot of attrition process and there's a lot of court action, and which sort of unsettles you perhaps in stretches of period. And the only time I get to listen to music perhaps is when I'm traveling in my car.
I was thinking of what Shakespeare said. The man who hath no music in him is fit for treasons, stratagems and spoils. There are no sex scenes in this book. Is that because of the Bunker 13 award you got? He got a Bad Sex Award for Bunker 13. It's a worldwide award.
No, I mean, there are some scenes actually, but marginal, you could say. Yeah, I guess I couldn't quite get into the skin of how the ancient Greeks would be doing that.
Yeah, that's really all the questions I had to ask. Would you like to say something about book now that your daughter brought it back to your memory yesterday? What you remember now? It was 4 years ago, and events have put it out of your head. What do you think about it?
Actually, to tell you frankly, I visited Greece after I finished the book. And it was a strange experience. I mean, usually writing non-fiction, you are right in the thick of it, like Iraq. I've been traveled extensively in Iraq before I even thought of attempting the book that I am doing right now. But Greece, strangely, by some weird combination of circumstances, it just emerged from my head, and then I visited the place after having written The Emissary, and it was fascinating to visit it as if I had, I have done my labor and now I can just visit the sites and soak in the Acropolis and the islands and the sort of laid-back olive-eating culture that must have existed and still exists in Greece. And I couldn't really find the industry which we all know Greece for. I mean, there is still a lot of cacophony. Bangladeshis sort of have taken hold of Athens, and they are the new Spartans, there's this whole friction happening in Greece between the new immigrants, and obviously they're going through a very bad time right now, started 2007-8 in the recession. And so it was fascinating visiting the places after you had instead of the other way around.
You don't feel like rereading the book now?
No, I'll save that for my sequel if and when I get down to doing it.
Okay, thank you everyone for listening, and thank you so much, Anirudha. I've been looking forward to this for 4 years. I'm glad
Thanks
I got
a
a
lot.
chance.
I'm glad that you liked the book, and I'm glad that you had the patience to go through 400 odd pages.
I reread it now, just before this. I liked it. I like to reread books I do like, so it was no penance.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you for this excellent session. We now request Mr. Altaf Tayarwala to hand over the token of gratitude to Mr. Anirudha Bahal.